Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back to today's program. Earlier today, we heard the inspiring lecture by Professor Baert from Cambridge University on the rise of Sartre as public intellectual. And now we will have a seminar discussion on Professor Baert's sociology of intellectuals, more precisely his positioning theory of intellectuals, and we're also going to examine some implications of Professor Baert's position for the phenomenon of the social engagement of intellectuals. As I mentioned earlier, Professor Baert is the guest of the Group for Social Engagement Studies, some of whose members are here. And joining us for the seminar will be Dr. Marcus Morgan from Cambridge University Department of Sociology, who will give us a short presentation on a new project that he has been working on together with Professor Baert, which bears the title Positioning Theory and Academic Controversies, the McCabe Affair. So Marcus will be our first speaker. And then also we have here Professor Ivana Spasic from the Faculty of Philosophy, Department of Sociology, and my colleague from the Institute, Srđan Prodanović. And we will offer some short commentaries on Professor Baert's perspective and then invite Professor Baert to respond to the questions he finds interesting. And afterwards, if there's still time, we might open the general discussion. So I would now like to give the word to Dr. Marcus Morgan. Please.
Thank you. So thanks for organising this, Marion. I understand this morning Patrik talked about the rise of Sartre after World War II and how positioning theory might be an interesting way of analysing his rise to fame. What I'm going to try to do is two things. Firstly, to briefly introduce a case study that Patrik and I have been working on in order to show how positioning theory might also be of use in analysing conflicts amongst academics. Secondly, to show how positioning theory can be productively synthesized with other social theoretical positions, in particular the new school of cultural sociology that's grown up around the Department of Sociology at Yale and an institute there, which I believe Ivana is also associated with. So this case study was what the media dubbed at the time the McCabe Affair, and it was a public controversy that erupted in the winter of 1980 to 1981 over a young assistant lecturer in the Cambridge English faculty failing to be upgraded to a permanent post. And most of those who are in support of him and who are outraged by the fact that he wasn't upgraded to a permanent post argued that this was something to do with his association with forms of French literary theory. It's worth noting that during his doctoral studies, which he undertook at Trinity College, Cambridge, McCabe had spent a year studying at the École Normale Supérieure, and by his own account, whilst he was there, he involved himself deeply in Parisian intellectual life, and as he claims, worked with Althusser, Derrida, and attended Barthes seminars and Lacan's lectures. So he was very kind of influenced by the currents in French theory that were going on during that period. We started our analysis of this affair from the assumption that the pure fact of Colin McCabe's failure to be upgraded to a permanent post was simply that. It was just simply an empirical occurrence without any significance one way or the other in its facticity. And this can be shown by noting that various other assistant lecturers in other departments throughout the university had previously come up for review to be converted to a full-time post. Some of them had made it, some of them hadn't. At exactly the same time that the McCabe Affair was being considered, there were in fact two other people within the Cambridge English faculty, one of them who eventually made it to a permanent post, another one who didn't. Again, not a big deal was made in either of those cases. So this raises the question, we argue, of how and why a controversy ensued in the particular McCabe instance. And if there's one thing for certain, it's that a controversy did indeed ensue. And this is, as evidence of that, this is just a few clippings from one national newspaper in the UK called The Guardian. But it was covered in all of the nationals. It was covered obviously in the local press and the student press. It was also covered in some international weeklies. It was on news. It was on Newsnight, which is a big kind of program that gets very high viewer ratings in the UK. And it was on the radio. It was, for a short time, there was a huge media storm around it. It quickly died down, but it was a very big event at that moment. In order to answer this question of how and why a controversy took place, we draw, as I mentioned, upon American cultural sociology to argue that facts can't speak for themselves, but rather facts need to be narrated or told or indeed positioned in particular ways in order for events to acquire symbolic meaning. Facts only acquire meaning and become more than mere facts once they're coded in meaningful ways and positioned within culturally comprehensible narratives from which they derive their significance. I don't know if Patrik mentioned this morning, but part of positioning theory assumes a relational perspective, which is worth noting, in which meaning is not inherent within things, but meaning derives from the relationship between things or between objects and symbols themselves. Additionally, we draw upon cultural sociology's suggestion that a symbolic hierarchy exists within which facts about events can be positioned. And this symbolic hierarchy stretches between the Durkheimian poles of the sacred and the profane. The idea is that narrating facts at the more profane level in this symbolic hierarchy signals that whatever's occurred has done so within continuously and tacitly functioning norms and values, whereas narrating facts or positioning facts at the higher, more sacred levels in this hierarchy signals that these higher norms and even higher values have been brought into question, and therefore that a systemic crisis might have ensued, might have taken place. We suggest that this positioning of facts is performative, since it's aimed towards bringing into being some meaningful social reality that didn't exist in advance. In other words, the positioning moves that took place didn't merely reflect a pre-existent reality, but were actually forms of social action trying to bring into being new kinds of reality. In the analysis, we divide the warring parties, the camps in the controversy. It's more complicated than this, but as a very simple division between what we call the pros and the antis. The pros were those who wanted to inquire into the conditions surrounding McCabe's non-appointment, and the antis are those who wanted to close it down, didn't want an inquiry to take place, wanted to move on. Also, most of the quotes that I'm about to give, they come from a 2-day debate that took place about the fact that he wasn't hired, that took place in the university's Senate House. So whilst the pros were intent on positioning the fact that McCabe was not upgraded as a violation of what they considered the sacred, in other words, a violation of sacrosanct norms and values surrounding proper appointment procedure, the antis tried to position the fact of his not being upgraded as a profane matter, a matter of routine appointments considerations. In other words, his CV just wasn't up to the mark, or the teaching needs of the faculty didn't gel well with what he had to offer, or the research needs. The antis did, however, evoke the sacred, but not in reference to McCabe's failure to be upgraded, but rather in reference to both English literature itself and also the practice, or rather a particular kind of practice, of literary studies. This strategy first relied upon constructing the canon of English literature as a totem for English literature at large, a core collection of works that provided a coherent representation of the primary and sacred objects of the discipline. And secondly, the defence of a particular established method of literary study, what we might want to call humanistic literary studies, as definitive and coextensive with proper literary studies in general. And just as some evidence for this, Ian Jack stood up in the Senate House and claimed that it's our responsibility to keep the attention of students focused on great writers. Christopher Ricks told a newspaper at the time, it's our job to teach and uphold the canon of English literature. Howard Erskine Hill, a very prominent anti, argued that our first loyalty of all of us is to our subject, and Mike Long suggested that the theoretical interests represented by McCabe and others were irredeemably secondary and, in some sense, irredeemably unimportant in comparison with literature itself. The implicit moral load being placed on English literature here is of interest in its exemplifying one of the most common rhetorical tropes in the fracas, which is the remarkably frequent appeal to higher, often universal concerns above factional or personal interests. Such claims to be acting on behalf of something purer and more universal than personal gain or petty retribution drew attention away from whatever partisan positioning moves may simultaneously have been taking place and towards more lofty, venerable concerns. From a structural perspective, this comparative technique is also important in showing that the description of a motive as base is always a relative rather than an absolute designation. So in Douglas's famous analysis of dirt as the prototypical pollutant, she made clear that pollution always takes this relative form. What we tend to think of in absolute terms as dirt, she demonstrated, is better understood as simply matter out of place, which when placed within another context would not be considered a pollutant at all. So we might want to think about putting manure on a flower bed. That's not considered a pollutant, but obviously if you put manure on your enemy's bed or on your own bed, that is considered polluting. She writes that there's no such thing as absolute dirt. It exists in the eye of the beholder. Dirt offends against order. Eliminating it is not a negative movement, but a positive effort to organise the environment. So there were plenty of other contexts within the university and elsewhere in which charges of self-interest or personal gain that made sense of forms of corrupting bias and appointments considerations could be considered perfectly acceptable, even laudable motives. You might want to think about the sports field or exam competitions. It was the context, in other words, not the content that made them polluting. Looked at in this way, one element of the symbolic positioning struggles that took place within the McCabe affair can be understood as laying claim to contingent purification practices, to reorganising the environment of the faculty so that appropriate interests were taking place within their appropriate contexts. English studies, the antis argued, was the discipline that most defined the national culture. And the Cambridge English School, at least in their eyes, defined what the study of English in general should mean. This meant that the symbolic environment was arranged in such a way that the antis could position any threat to English literature as not only a threat to the local practice of English studies in Cambridge, but also a threat to the discipline at large, and what's more, even an implicit threat to the national culture itself. In this manner, the emotive momentum and symbolic weight of the affair quickly snowballed, rapidly assuming proportions well beyond its local effects in terms of whether or not a young lecturer was to be offered a permanent post. As the affair proceeded, this threat also became increasingly associated with and condensed into a single catch-all term, which was structuralism, which, in spite of repetitive protestations that it was of absolutely no relevance or value to the debate whatsoever, participants and commentators seemed incapable of ceasing to use. The term was frequently used by the antis as a simple epithet, aimed at stigmatising their opponents, and as a label it therefore quickly became imbued with a host of moral rather than simply designatory meanings. In this manner it served as imprecise shorthand for everything that the antis believed was wrong with the kinds of work they understood McCabe and others to be supporting. As one commentator put it, it became the term that the business as usual faculty majority chose as their omnium gatherum definition of the enemy. In this particular case, however, in order for this stigmatising strategy to work, the term itself needed to be repositioned as in fact the pollutant that the antis wished to claim it was, and more specifically as one threatening to the kinds of literary study that I've suggested the antis were intent on sacralising. If this could be achieved, then disinfecting the faculty of its influence might then be taken as being of paramount importance. Towards accomplishing this end, Howard Erskine Hill, who I mentioned briefly before, who was a prominent anti, suggested that in spite of the scientific pretensions of some of the structuralists, they in fact embraced a radical relativism he dubbed cognitive atheism, in which, I quote, "one interpretation is as valid as another, and touchstones, criteria, different degrees of probability, and indeed the concept of truth itself are carelessly thrown to the wind. He also highlighted structuralism's terminological imprecision and the fact that amongst the various definitions of structuralism, there was little that the philosopher could recognise as a theory to define them, suggesting that those who regularly associated with it were themselves muddled in their thought. In addition to positioning it as a sophistic doctrine, the antis also alluded to the fact that, like most pollutants, structuralism is a foreign thing. Foreign both in disciplinary terms, in the sense that it originated in linguistics and the social sciences, but also foreign in more obvious terms in the fact that it came from France. So that, as an onlooker from another university at the time noted, it became almost a matter of public hygiene not to read the structuralists and to discourage the student population from doing so. Commentators on the affair, such as the conservative philosopher Roger Scruton, I don't know if he's known in Serbia, but he's quite a prominent conservative figure in the UK, he aided the antis' efforts in positioning the term as a contaminating threat by flipping the notion, which we discuss elsewhere in the book, that Leavis's approach, the humanistic approach that was established in Cambridge, was elitist, and instead suggesting that the new French theory that McCabe and co. were understood to be championing was itself the truly elitist culprit, because it was this theory that failed to address itself to an idealised common reader, and instead chose to speak this private, technical and esoteric language. Likewise, another commentator, clearly assuming that structuralism was somehow necessarily a form of radicalism, pointed to the irony that compared to Leavisite criticism, structuralist writing, I'm quoting again, is so obscure that it totally bars any working class adult, the liberation of whose class is the declared aim of the philosophy behind such writing, from any comprehension of it at all. One challenge with maintaining this strategy of positioning structuralism as a toxic force, as with the former strategy of defending a predefined and stable notion of English literature and methods of analysing English literature, was that it inevitably at a certain point conflicted with the attempt to convince doubters that the anti-camp were welcoming of new ideas, capable of identifying their merits, and willing to integrate them into faculty teaching. There was, in other words, a problem of coherence across the antis' positioning repertoire. Moreover, the sting of the accusation was somewhat removed when those whom the label was contrived to discredit readily adopted it as a banner of pride, as, for instance, did this guy, who was at the time the Regius Professor of Greek, someone called Geoffrey Kirk, who stood up in the Senate House and proudly asserted that structuralism is an approach or set of approaches that cannot simply be ignored in any respectable university in Europe, adding, we might think rather dubiously, perhaps given the circumstances, that it's one that often increases understanding. He also suggested the antis were simply ignorant, and that to label the whole structuralist movement as somehow mindless and somehow wicked is the reaction of those who usually don't have the faintest idea of what it is really about. Also addressing this apparent ignorance and actively detaching structuralism's moral from its technical connotations, Raymond Williams, who is in the faculty at the time, attempted to parse out the various definitions of the term structuralism in a lecture he delivered to the faculty whilst the dispute was still raging, showing how whilst some of its definitions were able to operate within the dominant paradigm of literary studies, others made a fundamental break from it. Interestingly, he suggested that at least one dominant understanding of the term, that which points towards analysis of language and literature as an internal rule-governed system, structuralism might in fact be understood as a, and I quote, long-lost cousin who had emigrated from Cambridge via Empson in the late 20s and early 30s, visited North America where it had been associated with new criticism, and then returned back to Cambridge via France in a somewhat altered form in the 1960s. We might want to question that suggestion, but what's interesting is the fact that he was positioning it in these ways. Williams was suggesting that the approach of practical criticism initiated by the Cambridge critic Richards, who had left for Harvard in the late 30s and developed by his student Empson, was in some sense a form of literary structuralism avant la lettre. The significance of this counter-argument in terms of positioning structuralism was that contrary to the antis' claims, it could in fact be understood, at least in one of its guises, as having originated in germ form within the very faculty and social body that was now misidentifying it as alien and attempting to expel it. Writing elsewhere in The Guardian, Williams also argued that since the figures that made the Cambridge tradition famous, such as Richards, Empson, and the Leavises, F.R. Leavis and his wife Queenie Leavis, were themselves iconoclastic rebels against the gentlemanly model of literary scholarship, which they felt oppressed the discipline of their day, they were, after all, interested in modernism very deeply. Leavis was very interested in Eliot. Leavis got into trouble with the police for trying to teach Joyce's book Ulysses when it was banned. And because of this, the new work that McCabe and others in the faculty represented, in fact, showed a greater fidelity to this spirit of Cambridge English than the apparently defensive behaviour of the antis. So to conclude, I just want to make two brief points. Firstly, one thing that's interesting about both the anti-use strategy of positioning structuralism as a pollutant, as well as the various counter-strategies mounted by the pros to re-dignify the term, is that they demonstrate how ideas themselves, or even ideas about ideas, because it's not necessarily structuralism as perhaps sociologists, social theorists, philosophers might understand structuralism, but it was an idea of what structuralism was, often of journalists or of people who didn't really understand what structuralism was. But these ideas about ideas can be the objects of positioning moves just as easily as can individuals themselves. The second point I wanted to end on was that different strategies operating side by side can act to both support as well as to undermine one another, highlighting the importance of achieving coherence across one's strategic repertoire if one's overall positioning within symbolic struggles is to prove effective. So yeah, that's me done. If I fear that I might not have explained the case study well enough, so I'd be very welcome to receive questions if you want to understand more about a particular case.
Certainly, we can do that at the end, have a general discussion. But now we'll move on to. Thank you very much, Marcus. It's really interesting, yeah. And,
it would be good to have.
It will be good to have
scholars.
Yes.
We don't have them, as far as I know, because it's relate in a different way to the
I think
case.
Marcus forgot to say that the book is coming out in April.
great.
The book's coming out in April.
So basically
so
now.
2 books within 2 months.
Yeah.
Wow, perfect. Okay, so I'll now give the word to Professor Spasic, who will open the discussion of Professor Baert's positioning theory.
Okay, thank you. So I'm the teacher here, the učiteljica, and I will, as usual, do the boring part, in which the previous speakers skipped, and that is, well, not boring, but I think we need a basis, and that is an outline of Professor Baert's positioning theory, and please correct me if I do not summarize it well enough. So positioning theory developed by Professor Baert over the past 5 years, maybe, so 4 to 5 years, is a new approach to studying intellectuals and intellectual products, which is based on the idea of performativity, ultimately based on speech act theory, the idea that intellectual products should be looked at for what they do rather than what they mean in themselves, and they're seen as not just representations but as interventions in the world. Underlying premises are that the reception, survival, and diffusion, I'm quoting here more or less verbatim, of intellectual products, be it research programs, theories, concepts, or propositions, depend not just on the intrinsic quality of the arguments, but also on the range of rhetorical devices which the authors employ to locate themselves and position others within the intellectual and political field. The other premise is relationality, which entails that intellectual interventions do not have intrinsic meanings as such, but they acquire meanings in particular settings and they're dependent on the status, position, and trajectory of the author or authors and on the other intellectual products available at the time within the same field. The notion of positioning is taken over from social psychologists who have employed it to study face-to-face interaction. Obviously here the usage of the concept is extended to other forms of interaction mediated in various ways. But the basic idea is there that positioning refers to the process by which people attribute to others or to themselves a set of characteristics, and those attributions have a significant effect on how the attributed are perceived and therefore affect future interactions. So an intellectual intervention as such is not yet a positioning, it's an instrument, it's an in positioning, in a move, which positions the author within the field, and that's self-positioning, and by the same move usually the author or authors change something in the field, in the relational structure, which means a slight or bigger change in the position of other players, other agents in the same field. Not every intellectual product manages to bring about a significant intervention. It depends on the who is doing it and where he or she is standing at the moment, on the past history of past interventions and prestige, various forms of prestige, intellectual and not only intellectual, and I'll come back to that later. So one of the ideas of the approach, is, as far as I understand it, is to avoid determinism, of the idea of people simply internalizing the dominant values of society, but rather to emphasize the agentic aspect of intellectual moves, an agency and flexibility of actors, and the model claims to be superior to competing ones. And one of my questions would be I thought of asking the question of how both of you see the compatibility or the difference of positioning theory 2 in comparison to the strong program cultural sociology, but I now see that you have produced a whole book which basically claim, again, if I understood you well, that there is no necessary antagonism or we'll read the book soon. But if you feel like commenting on that, so they're compatible but not the same, and if they're not the same, if you mind making some more comments on that, I would be grateful. So why positioning theory and not just cultural sociology, Alexandrian version of it? There are some points that have sprung up in my reading of the papers that have been available to us, which is about 5 or 6 papers and chapters containing the outline of the theory and some of the applications to specific cases, including the Jean-Paul Sartre case. So I'll just list a couple of points that to me seem to be worthy of further discussion, and please feel free to drop any of them that you just think are stupid or do not lead into a fruitful, profitable direction. So after reading all of this material, I still am not sure I understand what is intellectual in the theory. So who are we talking about? Of course, there are definitions. I found 2. One is from the chapter by Baert and Shipman, Transforming the Intellectual, which says, an intellectual is defined as an individual who creates knowledge about an aspect of the natural or social world and relates this to existing knowledge, whereas knowledge is defined in its broadest sense as communicable ideas that convey cognitive value, which means it encompasses the artistic and religious as well as the scientific and reasoned opinion as well as demonstrated fact. However, in the paper, The Sudden Rise of French Existentialism, I think the definition is somewhat more restrictive. There, Professor Baert makes a distinction between intellectuals and critics, and you say that by intellectuals, I'm to those, so this is quote again, referring to those who tend to produce relatively innovative intellectual goods like plays, novels, or philosophical treatises. In contrast, critics, including many journalists, tend to paraphrase and comment on those products in journals or newspapers. So if we look at the theory not as such, as it's a wonderful theory if you read its outline, but if one wants to look at it as a possible research tool, so let's see, we are sitting here in Belgrade and we are sociologists and we want to see if this new proposal, this new model can be put to work in our, in researching our own academic setting or wider intellectual setting, or a third society, so not the France of mid-20th century or Cambridge English department of the 80s. I'm not sure what I would be, who I would be looking at. So would you, if we look at, let's say, columns and blocks, are intellectual interventions among them only those newspaper columns and blogs which are written by academics and intellectuals who have some kind of independent warrant, institutional warrant for being intellectuals? Is there a need to distinguish between one and the other column, which produce knowledge in the columns, but maybe are not derived, are not written by people whose main job is to create innovative enough knowledge? If we again start from the Serbian case, there are a lot of public actors who are very ambiguous. So this is not, I'm trying to insist that this, I do not mean it as a scholastic question, sort of like, what do we really mean by intellectual, just for the sake of making that crystal clear, but what should we do as your aspiring followers? For example, with stage actors, I don't know why, but in Serbia, film and theater actors are quite often public figures who are very, very glad to share with us the worldviews, their views of the Serbian society, where it should be going. Some of them have become politically active, have held public offices. Then a whole range of prominent religious dignitaries of the Serbian Orthodox Church. So, to be a bit cynical, I wondered if their opinions can be called reasoned, as one of your definitions includes. So, they may produce some kind of theological knowledge in their expert journals, but the general public does not know that, and the respect, the prestige they have, the weight of their public word, I would say, does not depend on the knowledge that they produce within their specific, more restricted professional field. So that would be one question. Another one would be a gender question. I don't know if that's because I'm a woman or because I'm just a sociologist, but it also comes as a question to me: are women less likely to become public intellectuals? Because I didn't say that positioning theory says of itself, presents itself as being especially superior to competing theoretical models in the way it connects a more restrictive internal academic field to a broader intellectual field, to a public field of public debates. So along those lines, I would say that if we start from the more restrictive field, from what I know, women are often more reluctant, if they are expert in something, to go out into the public and make comments on things which are not within their very specific and usually empirically grounded expertise. Whereas men, again, of course, we do not speak of yes or no, not about categories. We speak of tendencies, the statistical probabilities. And it's not just in Serbia. I've talked to colleagues, sociological colleagues, both male and female in other contexts as well, and many of them have had the same impression that it's easier for a host of reasons. Maybe it's more likely, or it's easier for men. Men feel it more easy for them to just go out and say, I think this, or this country should do this or that, or you know what I mean. Especially the authoritative public intellectual kind, and my colleagues will discuss your typology of public intellectuals in more detail. The next question would concern, again from a Serbian perspective, the dimension of the relation between a local, or better, national context and the global one. You do not discuss that a lot, at least not explicitly. So if you promise that your proposal works better in explaining why certain individuals become notorious, become popular, become famous, and others do not, it seems to me that it would be necessary to include in a systematic way this dimension too. So obviously it's not all the same where you start from, where your beginning position is. In a small country or a big one, in a small language or a big one, so the corollary of this is the question of the scope or the intended reach of your model. Do you think it should work, or is it intended as a more or less universal model? Should it work in any society, or at least be tried out in any society, or only in the West, and where in the West? Are there some social, political, cultural presuppositions, prerequisites that should be met, fulfilled, in order for the model to work? Like a certain level of literacy, a certain level of affluence, a certain level of development of higher education. That's only some aspects that come to mind. But you have nowhere made that specific. And let me add one more, and that is a very down-to-earth sociological question, or allow me to call it measurement under quotation marks. So if you you propose to systematically establish relations or connections between an intra-intellectual arena and a broader intellectual, and not only intellectual but also political and moral social field. How exactly do you propose that we should do it? We all understand, or all of us who have read your papers about Sartre, we understood how you did that in that case. But if we take a case which is not so obvious, I'm not sure we know what you propose to do. So what would the elements of this broader, you say that ideas are more likely to succeed, to spread rapidly if they resonate with the broader cultural climate. What would that climate actually consist of? What would its elements be? How do we relate like one by one elements of the internal intellectual structures of meaning and events or phenomena in this broader world? And how do we know that some ideas resonate? And how do we measure this resonance or not? Because I see the danger of after the fact just establishing that a set of ideas and approach won because it won, basically. And you see what I mean. Yeah. So you have been convincing in the Sartre case, but again in Serbia or in other places, I believe in the US also, you have whole worldviews which are very much antagonistic, very much in conflict, and they all resonate in ways. So what do we do? Maybe some of them are just more powerful in less democratic settings like Serbian one. Maybe someone because they had political power at their side. You also do not address censorship, at least not in the papers I've read. But that's a new issue which I do not want to go into because I've taken already too much of everyone's time. So that's my part. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Professor Spasic. And now we go on to Srđan Podanović.
Okay, thank you, Marian. I will further reflect on things that Professor Spasic said, and I will try to connect them with today's lecture, namely the Sartre case study. So, in his case study analysis of the role that Sartre's existentialism played in France after and during the Second World War, Patrik Baert tries to show us how engagement interacts with wider institutional and socio-political environment. His research is therefore marked with an effort to distance himself from previous sociological research on that topic, namely Bourdieu, Collins, Gross, which tended, according to his opinion, to study and this is a quote from the power struggle of French intellectuals and at the end of the Second World War, study the intellectual field insofar as it is relatively autonomous from other fields. Then secondly, analyze the strategies of intellectuals within academic institutions. And thirdly, analyze power struggles in intellectual arena insofar as they tie in with status, recognition, or consecration. As Professor Spasic already told us, Baert's intention is to study engagement as a phenomenon that applies interconnectedness of the academic and political field in which intellectuals took part in theoretical debates and power struggles both within and outside the world of academia. Positioning of intellectual in that sense is at least partly dependent on contingent historical factors. And theory, this is also a further implication, will exert more influence in the public sphere if the author pays attention to specific character of the social context in which he operates. Now, some of the more explicit conditions that Baert detected during his study of French existentialism championed by Sartre suggest that success of reaching and influencing a wider non-academic influence depends also whether ideas are packaged in terms of coherent intellectual doctrine and properly labeled, then also structural relationship of those intellectual vis-a-vis intellectual establishment is also one of the crucial factors. And also what is important, as Baert notices, is whether the intellectual or the theory that is proposed from the publicly engaged intellectual manages to resonate with the recent socio-political experiences, and importantly, whether it does so better than the older established ideas. As we have seen from today's lecture, Sartre's rendering of existentialism was indeed very successful in satisfying all of these conditions which are superficially reconstructed here, and that resulted basically in the fact that existentialism rise to global recognition as the publicly engaged, as the form of public engagement. However, one can ask a seemingly banal question. Why was Sartre selected as a case study protagonist? And of course, an obvious answer would be to repeat the fact that his name is even today virtually synonymous with the term engagement, and I don't mean in academia, outside academia, of course, and that sociological insight into the pragmatics of his intellectual positioning might give us better understanding of how we can develop a modern account of public engagement. But I would argue that there is a deeper motivation for this kind of focus of Baert's research. And in order to understand these broader implications for Baert's case study, we must reflect on his three ideal types of intellectual that can be found in his paper named Transforming the Intellectual, which he co-written with Alan Shipman. First, we have the authoritative intellectual, or as Baert calls him, a generalist, who is able to cover a wide array of social topics. This ideal type was usually more common at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, when the number of people who enrolled in higher education was significantly low. Authoritative intellectual can be scholars without any ties to academia or science, science practice at academia, actually. In the period when they were most common, the universities have not yet acquired a monopoly on this dissemination and knowledge of knowledge, so this is mainly the reason why they can be outsiders. he practices, the authoritative intellectual practices vertical authority, meaning that, as Baert puts it, they speak at rather than with their audience. And this vertical authority, and you said actually when I asked the question today something about this, also implies some kind of general approach which might also imply metaphysical rendering of the world that enables him to speak in such manner, to be a generalist. On the other hand, or secondly, professional intellectuals emerge once the universities consolidate their dominance over knowledge creation. Validation of their status and also their power comes from the universities and from peer recognition. And this is the only way in which ideas get dispersed when we are speaking about the professional intellectuals. Professional intellectuals also operate within a relatively strict boundaries of the scientific disciplines, which are made possible by gradual consensus about which scientific methods as scientific vocabularies are appropriate for which kind of purposes. According to Baert, this kind of intellectuals can usually get publicly engaged either through popularization of soft paradigm within their disciplines, like Dawkins' book about the selfish gene, or through attacking some mainstream view and offering an alternative description of his discipline, like Chomsky or some other Einstein and guys like that. And last, we have a relatively new ideal type found in the public arena, and he is called, Baert calls him the embedded intellectual. Unlike the previous two, this kind of intellectual, according to Baert, cannot perceive themselves as being above the layman audience, because the critical capacity of the public has been enlarged thanks to a much higher percentage of well-educated public, as well as the increasing specialization of intellectual work. Therefore, embedded intellectuals must become more open to a dialogue with a wider public if they wish to convey any kind of message. Together with Baert, we can argue that this necessity of engagement is largely came about as a result of neo-pragmatic critique of foundationalist philosophy, as well as developments in modern science. There is also two kinds of this kind of embedded intellectuals. There is the persuader and the dialogist, the intellectual who is more inclined to put himself in a dialogue with his public. Persuaders are roughly come from natural sciences, and humanities and social sciences are more dialogical. Now, coming back to the Sartre case study, we can now interpret the whole analysis of existentialism as a form of Baert's own engagement aimed at deconstructing the authority of the authoritative intellectuals by showing its generalist nature has nothing to do with some sort of higher insight or God's view that they usually tend to convey to their public, but rather to be a pragmatic positional adaptation to contingent historical circumstances that in fact enable them to claim such an epistemological high ground over a wide variety of social topics. And you also spoke a little bit about this in your lecture, but this is particularly you could particularly see this in Baert's analysis of Sartre's books Anti-Semite and the Jew, where he criticizes the crudeness of purely phenomenological method, as Sartre calls it, used to depict his four ideal types in the book: the anti-Semite, the Democrat, and the inauthentic Jew and the authentic Jew, which was basically based as, and I quote here, from sporadic interviews which he conducted with Jewish friends. This is what Baert quotes Sartre. Sporadic interviews which he conducted with his Jewish friends, most of whom were integrated and secular intellectuals, and with 100 people with an anti-Semitic disposition. Lack of any kind of historical or sociological method led Sartre to reproduce anti-Semitic stereotypes. Absence of concrete analysis of historical data about the Jews also enabled Sartre to avoid the fact that the collaboration of Vichy regime in Holocaust in order to be in compliance with the dominant narrative of de Gaulle's France, according to which most of French men and women were resistance fighters. One of the implications of this Baert's, the construction of the authority of the authoritative intellectual seems to be that we should not think of embedded intellectual as some sort of symptom of the overall decline of publicly engaged scientists, but rather as a new democratic potential. And now I have after this reconstruction, I have just a few short questions. You can also drop them if you find them inappropriate, which I would like to raise. Now, does specialization of modern scientific vocabularies might lead us to some sort of fragmentation of critical capacities of public sphere? Namely, if all of us are well versed within one vocabulary that we acquired during our studies, how do we know that simplification that even embedded intellectuals must carry out in their public engagement do not foster some sort of manipulation? Does social theory have a role in in prevention of this kind of manipulation? Does this imply a new kind of non-authoritative generalist and intellectual? And a second set of questions, although science and philosophy have increasingly been described in a non-foundationalist terms, our everyday life is still full of common sense essentialisms that mimic a theoretical insight, depicted, for example, in Michael Billing's book, Banal Nationalism, or many kinds of chauvinism that we can see. These essentialisms are, however, part of what Rorty calls, and Marian will reflect on this in more detail, final vocabularies, and therefore should not be subjected to the redescription by liberal ironists. And my question would then be, how do we overcome these obstacles and still remain both anti-foundationalist and publicly engaged? And finally, how does Baert see the relation between theory and common sense? So,
could you repeat the three questions?
The last three. The last.
All of them.
All of them. Okay, so.
There are only three.
Yeah. Okay, so firstly, does specialization of modern scientific vocabularies lead to some sort of fragmentation of critical capacities of public sphere?
I think we all share that.
Yeah, that's a common.
You're so optimistic about this rising immunity of the lay public too.
And specialization of scientific vocabularies. Okay, so that's the first, but then there.
Is that what? Sorry? The specialization of scientific vocabularies
and then.
Does it lead to a fragmentation?
Does it lead to fragmentation of critical capacities of the public sphere? And that would be the first question. And does social theory, the second question would be, that whether embedded intellectuals, when they do some kind of simplification of this kind of specialistic vocabulary, do they can they be subjected to some kind of manipulation, or basically does this simplification foster some kind of manipulation? And if it does, how do we prevent it? So that would be the second important questions. And the third is, how do we remain anti-foundationalist and publicly engaged? And your view on relation between theory and common sense. So those are the questions. That's that.
Thank you. We have time. So now I will also briefly reflect on Patrik Baert's typology.
Also great. Okay, right. Okay. Yeah,
Typology of engaged intellectuals. So as Sergeant mentioned, within his theoretical perspective on the transformation of the public intellectual, Baert distinguishes between three ideal types: the authoritative, the professional, and the embedded type. It is not entirely clear, however, in my opinion, how this typology relates to the Rortian fundamental distinction between the metaphysical or foundationalist and the ironist or anti-foundationalist public intellectual. In principle, it seems to me that all three types that Baert proposes could fall within either of the Rortian camps. We can easily imagine contemporary authoritative or professional anti-foundationalists, as well as embedded metaphysicists. For example, Rorty himself, I believe, was more akin to an authoritative than an embedded anti-foundationalist public intellectual, while many so-called organic Marxist intellectuals operating at the base of social reality, so enhancing the class consciousness of people in everyday contexts of popular discontent in a seemingly open and egalitarian dialogue, would in fact be an example of embedded metaphysicists. Despite these ambiguities, it seems to me that Baert's perspective does imply that the first two varieties of engaged intellectual, the authoritative and the professional one, overwhelmingly tend toward the foundationalist camp, given that they rely on what Baert calls vertical authority, and that the normative validity of their statements is generally derived from some more or less comprehensive and outsider perspective on social reality, which seems to be most compatible with one or another form of epistemological realism. As Baert portrays them, these two varieties of public intellectual rely more on what we would call the classical speculative reasoning in their evaluation of social reality, rather than on deliberative or dialogical reasoning, which is constrained by particular socio-historical contexts and the necessity of reaching an intersubjective consensus among social actors with radically opposed worldviews. So Baert says that professional engaged intellectuals make statements that draw on epistemic or logical certainty, referring to corroborated findings or reasoning. On the other hand, the primary operative mode and normative foundation of Baert's embedded intellectual, who is egalitarian in outlook and open to the possibility of learning from an educated public, seems to be precisely dialogical reason, which is far more compatible with post-metaphysical thought in both the Habermasian and Rortian sense of the word. So it does seem that we are, for the most part, justified in juxtaposing the authoritative and professional intellectual on one hand with the embedded one on the other hand, along the lines of the foundationalist, anti-foundationalist divide, but I would nevertheless invite Patrik Baert to elaborate a bit on the complex ways in which these two typologies, Rorty's and his own, intersect. Based on this brief interpretation, I would like to ask Baert, so given his general pragmatist orientation and his criticism of the so-called declinist thesis in sociology of intellectuals, whether he considers the figures of authoritative and professional engaged intellectuals as legitimate at all within contemporary liberal democratic societies, notwithstanding their continuing empirical presence, or whether only the embedded form is really compatible with a truly democratic anti-foundationalist form of engagement. If not, on what basis should the former two figures ground the validity of their normative interventions in the public sphere once we have discarded realism, positivism, and representationalism? So I see this question as the crucial motivating force behind the projects of, for example, contemporary critical theorists such as Habermas, Honneth, and Nancy Fraser, who attempt to articulate a post-metaphysical yet comprehensive and diagnostic forms of social critique and theoretical engagement. Let me briefly present my own standpoint regarding this matter, which is also an invitation to Baert to elaborate on the place of domination in his perspective. And I will rely on a particular interpretation of Luc Boltanski's theoretical perspective, as I find it very fruitful for reflecting on the phenomenon of intellectual engagement in the context of contemporary capitalism. Despite the fact that the anti-foundationalist piecemeal social engagement focused on concreteness and immersed in everyday action, which is basically the embedded intellectual's engagement, is the only really unproblematic form in the philosophically post-metaphysical and culturally pluralist context, I would argue that the practical need for the kind of engaged intellectual who offers what we might call a comprehensive social critique persists today. The reason, I would argue, is that liberal democratic societies integrated into post-Fordist capitalism exhibit characteristics of what Luc Boltanski has termed the institutional regime of complex domination, or domination through the symbolic interiorization and regulation of social critique and structural change on the part of the institutional system. Boltanski's conception of the projective city as a specific regime of justification crucial for the legitimation of contemporary capitalism, in my opinion, captures well the logic of the ideological incorporation of anti-foundationalist, concrete-oriented and piecemeal reformist sentiment of embedded intellectuals into the process of socioeconomic reproduction. The projective city as the increasingly dominant regime of justification in contemporary capitalism, which supplants, for example, the industrial and the commercial city, successfully, in my opinion, blurs and practically eradicates the boundary between the embedded piecemeal intellectual engagement outside the institutional realm and the systemic engagement of intellectuals within institutionally envisaged and funded projects, so within the institutional system. And as Baert himself notices in some places, it has become ever easier and ever more tempting for engaged intellectuals outside the university system to cross this boundary and become entrepreneurs within the broader projective city without necessarily having to enter the oppressive neoliberal university itself. And I'm here thinking of like independent intellectuals who start applying for projects funded by these international foundations, which might be independent from the university system, but which are nevertheless state-funded. And the regime of complex domination is thus able to almost eradicate what Boltanski calls the hermeneutic contradiction between the world, by which he means the chaotic totality of everyday action which escapes symbolic closure, so what he calls the flux of life, and on the other hand, the instituted reality of the capitalist socioeconomic order. So in a regime of what he calls simple domination, the hermeneutic contradiction is mostly ineffectively suppressed through a more or less rigid institutionalization of reality, which does not tolerate critique. So that, in my opinion, the reopening of this hermeneutic contradiction between the institutional realm and the world of everyday action can best be achieved exactly through the anti-foundationalist focus on the concrete, the piecemeal reform, and the experimentation of the embedded intellectual, which subvert the imposed universality of the instituted reality by drawing from the world, this is a quote from Boltanski, by drawing from the world new examples that endanger the completeness of established definitions and cast doubt on the universal character of confirmed relations, as Boltanski puts it. However, in a regime of complex domination, and this is my very loose kind of interpretation of Boltanski's perspective in the context of your typology. However, in a regime of complex domination, the instituted reality itself simulates the anti-foundationalist openness, its focus on the concrete and the readiness to experiment. What Boltanski would say, critique is disarmed through a plurality of interventions, the alteration of test formats and of reality itself. So the openness is actually simulated because the foundation of projective post-Fordist capitalism, the foundation being the market economy, is still very much instituted and reproduced through a generalized set of legal principles whose application results in enormous social inequalities which undermine the prospects for any real experimentation on the part of social actors. So in a regime of complex domination, I would argue that the hermeneutic contradiction between the world and the instituted reality can best be reopened precisely by a new form of comprehensive critique, or what Boltanski would call an existential test or a meta-critique, which exposes the false nature of the system's openness and locates the structural causes of the persistent power differentials. And this kind of critique, I would argue, can best be provided by what you term the authoritative and the professional intellectual. And thus, despite its epistemologically problematic foundations, such form of critique seems to me as an essential complement to all forms of anti-foundationalist critique and engagement, but the question remains, what should be its normative foundations? That's it. Yeah, you heard the commentaries, and now I would invite Professor Baert to reflect, to respond to the questions that he considers most fruitful.
Marcus, do you want to? Sorry? Is there something you want to say?
I could answer what you would, the question about cultural sociology if you want. if that was more directed towards this, or I can do that after you.
No, please go ahead.
So just to remind me, the question was,
Why
what's
do you
the
need
difference? Why do you need positioning
theory?
theory if you've got cultural sociology,
Yeah.
Alexandrian
Yeah.
cultural sociology? So I suppose I only mentioned a certain aspect of this case study, of this book, which is kind of the second half of the book. The first half of the book is all to do with material analyses. In other words, it analyses the coming to power of the Thatcher government. It analyses the post-Robbins report boom in student numbers, the different demographics running into the university. After, in the 60s, there was a massification of the universities in the UK. It analyses the complex institutional structure within Cambridge itself because of the colleges, and how that influenced the form of the different struggles, positioning struggles that went on. So that first half of the book was to argue, although the cultural sociology, the strong program, we found very useful, one of the prescriptions that they seem to give, I think methodologically for research, is to say that you should bracket out non-symbolic forms. So in other words, bracket out material elements of analysis.
At least as a first step.
At least as a first step, yeah. So completely in the face of that, I would say that in order to understand certain non-symbolic cultural aspects, you need to understand the material contexts in which they arise, otherwise you can't understand them at all. So I wouldn't, even if you're interested in the cultural, even if you're interested in the symbolic, I still think it's certainly important to take into account the material, because these are just abstractions. The symbolic is, or the cultural is just an abstraction, so is the material. Virtually any cultural event has some material element in which a book is a material thing, or sound is. There's always some material element, and that usually influences the. So I guess that does that go some way?
So you mixed
I can give you
cultural sociology with Bourdieu, but without admitting it.
With Bourdieu.
That, at least the way you presented the first part, that's all. I'm sorry, sounded like Bourdieu to me. The history of the field, the basic.
I guess where
I didn't want to ask that question, but now it's on the table as well. So difference from Bourdieu to, but you can skip, of course, that calls again for this question too. You can just select what you want to respond.
Because there is, because the focus here is not on. It's not on trying to find a link between, say, the social background or context or trajectory of the individuals involved and the kind of work which they produce. The focus is really on the kind of work that is produced and the kind of effects that it does have. And I think, so the difference with Bourdieu is very much that we try to move away from the idea that we should focus our attention to the extent to which certain social variables can help us to explain how and why certain types of work are being produced. Now, the difference with cultural sociology, besides what Marcus so well explained, the difference is also that in a way that the focus is slightly different, because we're particularly interested in the question how certain ideas become diffused and others do not. And if they're diffused, in what kind of circles do they get diffused? And that's where positioning theory comes into play. So that approach then can be, as I tried to explain in a couple of articles, can also be used to account for why in certain contexts, certain texts achieve a canonical status and others do not. and how particular form of tradition is developed in particular fields. And so the focus of attention is quite different from cultural sociology in that sense. Now, to come back to, I mean, I can't really answer all your questions, but there's so many of them, but and I think we need to, maybe some people in the audience have. But I mean, but thank you very much, thank you very much for all these interesting comments. Women, I think that's a really quite interesting one. Are women less likely to become public intellectuals? And then you said, well, women are less likely to go beyond their specific expertise. And I think on the face of it, that there seems to be some truth to that. Yeah? But so that would then probably mean that we're less likely to have women as authoritative public intellectuals who
embedded maybe more.
Yeah. So which in some respects you could say yes, that's probably the case. I mean, if you take, for example, somebody like to stick to the French case, in the Sartre case, if you take somebody like Simone de Beauvoir, in some respects she also operated as an authoritative public intellectual, but at the same time she did sort of develop her own expertise and tended to intervene within that specific expertise, which she set out in her book in the late 1940s. And indeed, a lot of female public intellectuals tend to operate within the realm of gender, for example, indeed, focus their attention on those issues that are related to that specific expertise. So I tend to agree with it, at least for the time being, in the context which we are familiar with. Now, with regard to sort of nations and global context, there's certainly certain contexts in which work that is produced can resonate locally and can be such that you get a certain amount of symbolic or institutional recognition locally and not get it beyond the local. I mean, considerable amount of academic work in some Latin American countries in the humanities and social sciences are of a particular nature that you can achieve a certain amount of local recognition, but with it being unlikely to lead to broader symbolic institutional recognition beyond the global context. So yes, the two don't necessarily go hand in hand, and indeed, there could be a number of interesting cases to be studied where that is not the case. But there was an interesting question you asked about. You said, how can we sort of use this more broadly in other contexts? So, what would resonating with a specific context mean? Right? And I tried to make the case for the Sartre case, and then your point is yes, but ultimately you could have a post hoc reconstruction, and so how would it work in other contexts? It would have to be a similar sort of hermeneutic process where you do an in-depth analysis of the specific context and try to study the relationship between the intellectual interventions and that context, and indeed also study, of course, the extent to which the media responds to the intellectual interventions and so on. So there isn't a sort of cut and dry answer to the question. It really has to be studied in that specific context. There is a danger, you're right. There's a danger that you reconstruct post hoc. But that's what we have. If we work historically, we will be confronted with specific contexts where some intellectual currents became successful and others did not. And then we try to account for it. But of course, we already know which ones have been successful respectively. So it's not a predictive endeavor. And that, that is, of course, the nature of the beast. Censorship, actually in the book there's quite a bit about censorship, because
We'll wait for the book.
because of the occupation, the resistance intellectuals were facing a very specific dilemma about speaking out or writing. They had basically two options. One is to stick to clandestine publications. The second option was to write through official outlets, but then they had to bypass the censor, or they had to go through the censor. And the intellectuals associated with the resistance sometimes opted for the first strategy, sometimes for the second, sometimes for both, as in the case of Sartre. If you opted for the second strategy, then you had to try to convey your political message in a way that could deceive the censor. But then the question is, how can you then get your message across to a broader audience? So there are all sorts of complexities that came into play in the specific context that I studied in the book. And at the moment, Marcus and I are working on the 1970s in South Africa and the anti-apartheid movement, where similar issues were at stake, where certain things could not be said, could not be written. With regard to the other comments, the feeling I got from the comments you made, the feeling I got was that you thought that I maybe portrayed the embedded intellectual as too positive, or that I was too optimistic about that particular.
There are some problems with its potential. I'm not saying that it doesn't.
So I didn't want to give that impression at all. I'm sorry if it came across that way. I was simply trying to indicate how a number of societal and technological developments have made it more likely for this type of public engagement to occur. I didn't necessarily want to subscribe to this particular type of public engagement. But what were precisely the problems that you saw with this?
Well,
you talk about manipulation at some point.
Yeah,
Wasn't
because as you said, when you lay out the distinction, you say that with time, everything tends to converge on the embedded intellectual.
No, for the time being.
Okay, so
in the context with which I'm familiar, there seem to be a number of, we call it sociological variables that are coming into play, which make it more likely for the embedded intellectual to overtake the predominance of the other types of public intellectual. And I give a few examples of this. I'm not necessarily endorsing this development.
Do you think that it fosters some kind of new democratic? That's also partly what Marian said also. Does it foster some kind of new democratic, more pragmatic, like open intelligence like thing, or do you think that it's just a contingency?
What do you mean by contingency?
Just a historical contingency, meaning that today we have embedded, but perhaps in 20 years we have more authoritative intellectuals.
It's perfectly possible.
Yeah,
it's perfectly possible. And I don't know how deep this goes, by the way, if you talk about democratization. And I think that's why the notion of position, again, is quite relevant here, because the feeling I've got here is that we're talking about intellectuals who feel they need to position themselves in that particular light. And that applies also to Bauer, for example, in sociology. The notion of public sociology is precisely of that kind. It's a critical engagement but where you don't speak from above at your audience, but you use the knowledge of the audience, and they become co-producers of the knowledge. Now, to what extent this is a genuine democratization of the relationship between the intellectual and the audience, I'm not so sure about. But what seems to be the case is that in order to be heard and in order to find some kind of legitimacy, it seems to be necessary to take that particular position. And that's what I was trying to convey. And I think, I don't know whether this relates somehow to your question.
Yes, but I'd like to ask then, if you say that it's perfectly possible that in 20 years' time, once again, we have authoritative intellectuals as the dominant mode of engaged intellectual, how is this possible given the premise of the general change of cultural climate in terms, as Rorty himself has argued, it really seems that at least Western liberal democracies, the population, the wide social strata, generally have come to embrace anti-metaphysical stance or anti-foundationalist stance, at least to some extent, have kind of endorsed its basic epistemological premises and then the political implications of these premises. Rorty says something like, this means this is the strongest buffer, strongest barrier toward any form of political fundamentalism nowadays, and it seems that the populations of these well-educated, rich democracies have generally reached that stage where they have that barrier because of this kind of post-metaphysical climate. And if we assume that this process will go on in the future,
But I don't.
you don't. It can turn around completely.
It could, yeah.
Given the pressures of the economic crisis, the
In
rise
some
of
sense, it already has, isn't it? Even since Rorty died. I
In
mean,
what sense?
in the sense of global terrorism,
yeah.
in the sense of, even in intellectual spheres, in the sense of the return of realism, social ontology.
Oh, yeah.
I wouldn't say it's been so I don't think it's such a monolithic trend at all towards post-metaphysical.
Mm-hmm.
I think maybe within pockets of the humanities, but I think even if anything, it's starting to swing back a little. I don't know. It's kind of silly to generalise, I suppose.
I agree.
Yeah, very
I
interesting.
agree. Also, I'm not so sure whether I want necessarily to link this typology so clearly as you do with the distinction between the foundation and the Arianist.
Mhm.
So, I mean, it's a separate sort of categorization.
And they don't necessarily intersect in any way.
No, because even the well, no, they do. Of course, they do. But even the authoritative public intellectual doesn't necessarily need to rely on foundationist claims.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the authoritative public intellectual is somebody who, because of the right kind of trajectory, because of high status education, feels entitled to speak beyond their specific niche, so to speak, with a moral voice, with an element of certainty about a wide range of issues. Whether this involves foundationism, it can, but it doesn't necessarily have to.
Yeah, that's why I mentioned Rorty as an example.
Yeah.
I'd say as well, trends of growing economic inequality globally is creating divisions in educational attainment. I think there's all sorts of trends. The future's entirely open.
I mean, what seems to be the case is that the embedded intellectual emerges and very much, I mean, the technology plays a role there, or at least seems to do at the moment. And it also, to a certain extent, the technology also to a certain extent breaks the distinction between who is the intellectual and who is the audience, to come back to your issue about what's the intellectual. The other issue that is an important role for the emergence of the embedded intellectual is the rising educational standards across the board. However, other social variables can come into play and change this whole relationship. And so therefore, who knows what the future is in store. So maybe this notion of the embedded intellectual, insofar as it is indeed so prominent, maybe it will be short-lived.
And the place of domination in that.
Domination, not.
Yeah.
Yeah, we all had the same concern as Sergio mentioned, and that's the place of like relations of social domination, socioeconomic domination in your theoretical model. Where does it come in? And you talked a bit about neoliberal university in your papers, and I was thinking, how phenomena like the research excellence framework in the UK are kind of new instances of new, let's say, mechanisms of social domination, which I try to link then to this broader theoretical framework of Boltanski's idea of complex domination, domination through change, domination through simulation of openness, and the fact that you say that there is ever more, it's becoming ever easier for intellectuals who are independent of the university system to be co-opted into the system without necessarily having to enter the university. So through the media, through projects. So does this affect the prospects of engaged intellectuals today?
Sorry, I didn't quite get this. So you say people are able to get more involved?
Yes, I mean, I'm thinking of concrete examples like here in Serbia where it's becoming, I guess, increasingly widespread that people who want to be independent of universities nevertheless have to depend on financial sources from these foundations that I mentioned, and have to kind of channel their work in some standardized form of projects, and thereby they get co-opted into the system at some level as well. Of course, because of the economic pressures on them as well. Generally, the place of this kind of domination in your model.
Yes, but I mean, we should be careful not to present a sort of over-romantic view of the free-floating intellectual who is somehow in the past has been able to remove him or herself from financial or institutional pressures. They've always existed to a certain extent.
Yeah.
Of course, they take new forms. But I'm not so sure in what you say, not so sure what is new, as in significantly new, about in relation to domination, about the things that you observe now.
Domination, I mean, the sense of the production of kind of homogeneity, a production of cultural hegemony through these mechanisms, so co-opting of the critique, domination in that sense, I meant. And it seemed to me that in earlier stages you would have a more clear separation between what was considered to be the system, to speak in those terms, like colloquial terms, what was considered to be the institutional system and what was considered to be outside of it, and then the critique would kind of have to be directed most often from outside in the form of either authoritative or professional engagement.
But can you give an example where this was clear? What was inside and outside, historically?
Well, for example, you would have here in Yugoslavia in the 70s some university professors which subscribed to this humanist Marxist kind of left critique of the system. And in socialist Yugoslavia was very liberal in these respects that in other countries they wouldn't be able to even speak openly, I mean, in those terms. But here, Professor Spasic knows this better, of course, than me. Here they were able to speak openly, but they were expelled from the university, and they eventually were given posts here at the Institute of Social Sciences, and that's how our institute came to be, basically.
Because they didn't have to teach.
They couldn't teach.
not
They,
Trust people.
Correct,
Yeah.
yeah.
I see.
Yeah.
Okay.
yeah.
But they could write.
So, of course, now they were not outside of the system. In the end, they were inside the system, but for a while they were expelled, and that's because the system could not tolerate critique from within. But it could tolerate lots of critique from the outside. That's why it was called a kind of dictatorship in a velvet glove, because you would have like independent cultural workers or independent people who voiced their critiques of the system and were not necessarily silenced in a very extreme sense. But inside the system there could be no critique. However, that's what I called the regime of simple domination, where critique has to be expelled outside, into the world, as Polanski would say, the world, and then there's a clear boundary. And then I juxtapose that with the regime of complex domination, where the system tries to loosen or erase this boundary so that critique exists both, so that there is no outside in the end, so that there is a continuum of critique, and you can hardly say where the procity stops and where the really independent critique begins. And that's why what I consider to be new, maybe in the new formation, but I'm not sure. What do you think?
Yeah, but most liberal democracies have that feature.
You mean the
Well, that there's no clear in and out in the way in which more totalitarian regimes operate.
yes.
So in that sense, it's not new. I would say it's a feature of liberal democracy, that you have a loosening of these boundaries between in and out in the way in which you define it.
Even in the university system.
Even in the university system, and even at the moment, in the UK, of course, we to a certain extent dependent on production within the REF. To a certain extent, we're dependent on grant money we receive, and therefore we implicate it. But at the same time, people do produce work that can be seen as critical in the old-fashioned sense of the word.